McClatchy newspaper chain filed for bankruptcy that affects the state's largest newspapers and shines another light on the decline and future of local papers. Joining us for more on that tonight, Barry Saunders, former longtime columnist for the Raleigh News and Observer, and Alexandra Hudson, Novak journalism fellow and freelance writer with Young Voices. Good to see both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Barry is a longtime News and Observer alum. What did you make of the news yesterday?
Well, I was heartbroken, really, to see what has befallen such a great paper. But the thing is, some of the people who are there to whom I spoke, they seem pretty happy with it because they say it gives them a certain certitude about the future. And that sword of Damocles that was swinging over their heads is no longer there. At least they know what the future holds for right now.
But it doesn't seem like a great future.
Yeah, well, perhaps not, but at least it's better than being uncertain and knowing that the end could come at any moment.
Yeah, to have some kind of news.
Right.
Alexandra, you've been writing about this, about local news outlets in general, and calling it a story of death and rebirth?
That's right. There is this sort of lesser told story of hope. It's easy to look at the stories about, things like McClatchy's filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and think that's the full part of the story. But there's actually an enormous amount of creative civic energy, of innovation, of problem solving happening at the grassroots level across the country. And I've been studying this trend, for a number of months now. And that's a story of hope. In an essay I just wrote for Quillette, I told the story of Tim Swarens, who is a journalist here in Indianapolis, where I'm based, at the Indianapolis Star for over 3 decades, and all of a sudden was let go, surprisingly, last year for the same reasons, for the same financial reasons. He was a casualty of the same, kind of challenges that McClatchy's dealing with, and he thought his career was over. But instead, he realized he could be part of the solution, and he's currently leading a team of citizen journalists trying to figure out what the future of local news in Indianapolis is going to look like, realizing that the Indianapolis Star cutbacks are leaving an important gap for government transparency and civic engagement. And so he's not sitting idly by. He's studying other successful models of kind of new startups across the country and trying to establish what could work for the Indianapolis context. And that's a story of hope.
Barry, do you think that type of thing could happen in the state? I mean, you've tried launching online. Others have done other things. Do you think, we think about these institutions that may be dying. Of course, who knows what's going to happen, but is there a route out of this?
Absolutely, and I think the future lies, as Alexandra said, in papers such as the one that she mentioned, and in the one that I now publish, the SaundersReport.com, which is a local online newspaper that I like to think of as interactive, because a lot of the information I get comes from readers.
So what do you think that means for the future of these institutions, right? It takes a lot of resources to do those big investigative pieces and things that newspapers have been so well known for over the years.
Well, I think newspapers are going to have to join together and have joint ventures. But people have been sounding the death knell for newspapers for over 100 years. First, it was going to be radio, then television, then the internet. Everything was going to destroy newspapers. And I think the internet, to some extent, has succeeded at that, unfortunately. But I always think about what Thomas Jefferson said. If given the choice between newspapers and no government, or government and no newspapers, he would prefer to have newspapers and no government.
Well, and part of this, too, Alexandra, isn't part of this, too? I mean, we have generations of people that now have grown up only with the internet and have had, for the most part, everything free to them. And so finding a business model for this is challenging, right?
It is challenging, but there are people across the country who have proven to be up to that challenge. There are many of these sort of new outlets that are experimenting with the new models, new business models, because as we talked about, the old models that local and regional outlets relied on for almost 200 years, relying on classifieds, advertising dollars, and subscribers, those can't be relied on anymore, which is, again, why we're kind of in this situation. So outlets such as the Voice of San Diego, the MinnPost of Minneapolis, the Texas Tribune, the Colorado Sun. These have all been founded in the last 5 or 10 years, and they've all adopted a nonprofit, subscriber-based, all-online model to try and keep costs down and reporting high. And they've kind of taken an approach where they try to convince subscribers that to treat their local paper like they would, supporting your local symphony or something like that. That it's a public good that you're supporting. And in supporting local journalism, as you said, it's so important and very resource heavy to have these in-depth investigative projects, but they're so important. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein might be alive if the Miami Herald hadn't broke that story, or think of the Boston Globe and the Catholic Church sexual abuse scandal, and the Indianapolis Star here in Indiana broke the story of Larry Nassar and his abuse at USA Gymnastics. So it's very important, and it's encouraging that people and new institutions are rising to be a part of the solution.
Barry, do you think then that might mean that these sort of big newspapers might become a thing of the past? We might see more niche. We see it in North Carolina Health News with Rose Hoban and others. I mean, is that a potential line down the future, or do we need the big newspapers?
Well, it looks to me like we're going to have a handful of these large papers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, LA Times, and then it's going to be, as you mentioned, niche publications. And with the internet, the onset of the internet, newspapers were going to struggle anyway to deal with that, especially the advertising model. But I think what happened with McClatchy in particular was that the general manager, the CEO at the time, Gary Pruitt, went out and made this $5 billion purchase of Knight Ridder just at the wrong time. And that's when the bottom was falling out of the industry right there.
But nonprofit has its own sort of, not stigma, but from a profession standpoint, it's difficult. I mean, journalism already wasn't, I know people like to think, but journalism is not a way to get rich, right?
It's a calling. Journalism is a calling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And is that the way we kind of need to look at it moving forward?
I think most of us do. Those of us in it. Few people go in it to get rich, except people like you who get on television every night.
I hate to tell you this, Barry, but it ain't happening to that either. But
I'm shocked.
Alexandra, to that point, though, too, nationally, for local news, in particular with TV or newspaper or even radio, it's not a way to get rich, and nonprofit's not that way. So is it a natural fit, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to know, and Barry made this important point, that national outlets, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, they're thriving right now. They have flourished in recent years. If you look at their revenue numbers and subscriber numbers, they're doing very well. And I think that the temptation as these local and regional outlets, as they face these financial struggles, is to syndicate, is to put more nationally syndicated content on their pages and on their segments. But I mean, the downside of that is that it really has contributed to the polarization in our country of our public discourse, where often, and this is another part of my research, I've learned that often the local experience does not match the national experience, and the lived experience of everyday Americans doesn't live and die by the daily tweet or scandal of the news cycle, and that things are generally much better and more hopeful at the local level. But when these outlets are syndicating national content more and more, it gives this impression, it leaves this impression at the local level that things are worse than they really are. So that's another problem to keep in mind.
Yeah, well, let's hope we can all find solutions, because if there's one thing we do know, local news is very, very important. Good to see you both.